So after you get these tools in place and you have these on your website, the first thing to do is just get the codes installed and let the data start tracking. Because then you could really start running through some processes to actually analyze the data. There's two options that I like. One is just using spreadsheets and pulling some of the data in there because it gives you a lot of flexibility to evaluate things in different ways. The other method is using another free tool from Google called Looker Studio. That's another tool I recommend pretty highly for everybody. It's free and it allows you to make reports and visualize your data a lot better than you can in a spreadsheet or these analytics tools. So we're going to cover both of those. Now, when I'm setting up a report to evaluate marketing, the two biggest metrics I'm really looking at is how much does it cost to get a customer, and then what's my return on ad spend. So we've made a Google Sheet template that allows you to plug in a little bit of data and get a quick view on how those two metrics are trending for each marketing tactic and channel that you're using. This really lets you hone in on those two metrics, because what I find is there's so many different data points and so many different things you could look at. What I always like to try to do is how do we distill it down to 1 to 3 metrics that really matter instead of spreading ourselves too thin and looking at the hundreds of metrics you could find in Google Analytics. I always like to focus on just a few, and ideally a few metrics where we're actually going to take an action. That's another thing that can slow a lot of businesses down is there's so many different data points, but if you're looking at something and you're not going to actually change anything, it's essentially a waste of time. So really what I like to focus on is the metrics where, depending on how it's doing, if it's up or down, we're actually going to take an action and change something. So that's why we've really focused in less on traffic and engagement metrics and more on where our customer is actually coming from. So in this sheet, the way this sheet works is we input all of our marketing channels. So in this case, we're doing organic search. Local SEO would be the map listings that show up on the top. Paid search would be ads we're running on Google. And then referral would be like directories and third-party websites. And then we have social media. And we set a target cost per booked unit. So this will be dependent on your facility. But these two numbers you can configure and tailor, and it'll update the analysis that we'll get into. Really, the reason these are important is you want to know how much you can spend to acquire a customer and be profitable. So what's the maximum amount you can go to? And then you could use that as a benchmark for all your marketing and start to figure out which channels are actually below that number, which means we're more profitable than others, and which ones are above your cost per acquisition target that you're probably going to need to rethink because you're not profitable on those. So this you really need to tailor based on your own data. But once you do, all you need to do is change the number and the analysis will update. And return on ad spend, this is another factor. So we have what's our cost to get a lead, and then what's our actual return after we deduct the marketing costs. So the way I look at this, again, traditionally, this is just for ads like Google ads or Facebook ads, and you take the ad spend versus the revenue that's being driven. I like to actually factor in other costs. So for SEO, you don't pay for every click that comes in like you do with an ad, but there are a lot of costs involved with doing SEO. That could be a marketing agency you're working with, a consultant, maybe you have an internal team that's doing some of that work. So you really want to start to add up all those costs and fill that in this column. Same thing with local SEO, which is going to be like optimizing your Google business page, getting more reviews, directories, any software you're using. That way we can really start to evaluate what's working. Now, paid channels are the easiest to do a cost for because you're just going to look at your ad spend and any management fees. So all we need to do is fill in a few numbers here, and it's going to run a lot of analysis. So the only things I need are what am I spending on each marketing channel? How much traffic is each one driving? And this isn't even critical. It's just a nice to have. And then how many booked units each channel drove that month? And then what's the first month revenue that was driven from the book unit? And then we could run a bunch of other scenarios. So once you fill that in, ideally you have your Google Analytics set up where you could easily get these metrics. Otherwise, you may have to use another software or your property management software to get some of these. But once you fill these in, we can start to see what our cost per book unit is on each marketing channel. And then all the way on the right here, it'll automatically analyze which ones are doing well. So cost per conversion you want below your KPI, and then which ones are above, so that need to be fixed. So we can quickly see our target customer acquisition cost is $100, and we can easily see which channels are performing well and which ones we need to focus on. Now, the other piece we added in, because I think only looking at cost per lead and not looking at revenue can sometimes be misleading. So what we did here is, and you could configure this based on how often your customers tend to stay. I have it set to 12 months. So this will actually calculate it's a pretty simple formula. It's just going to multiply the monthly revenue by whatever number you set. And then this will give us our true return on ad spend by channel. And again, depending on what your benchmark is that you're trying to shoot for, we'll run the same analysis and start to see which channels are above and which ones are below.
Hey, John,
Mhm.
can you clarify what KPI is?
Yeah, so KPI is key performance indicator, just a fancy way of saying really like a metric that you care about. So really any metric or any data point can be a KPI for you. It's really the way I like to think about it is like, what's the most important one or two metrics that you want to track? In this case, I look pretty heavily on like cost per book unit and return on ad spend. But for you, you could always configure those differently. Maybe just the volume of book units is what you care about right now, and that could be your KPI. But yeah, it's essentially just any metric that you care about that you know is going to give you some insight onto what's working and what's not working. So
Thank
once,
you.
yeah, no problem. Once you have this analysis ran, what's interesting here is we could start, and these are some common scenarios you're going to see. You're going to start to see some channels that are performing well for both metrics. So we can see organic search and local SEO are above the goal we set for both metrics. So what this tells us is these two channels are working really well. So you have a couple options with these. We can either choose to just keep doing what we're doing because it's working, or you could start thinking about investing more in those channels if getting more customers is a priority. So this is basically your best performing channels are the ones that are performing above average or above your KPI on both of these. Now, you'll often also see scenarios where your cost per book unit is below what you want, but your actual return on the ad spend is above. So what that tells us is we're spending more to get a customer, but the customers we are getting here are spending more and booking more expensive units or spending more on average. So this is kind of an interesting scenario. When I see this, we still like to see if we can get this cost per conversion down. So what I would do here is if we were focusing on paid search, is start looking at your campaigns and trying to come up with ways we can get the cost per conversion lower. But because the return is so good, it's not as detrimental as it is when the cost per lead is high and you're not making money from it. So this is kind of an interesting scenario you'll see sometimes when what this also tells me is the customers that are coming from paid search are higher value. They're willing to spend more. So that's kind of an interesting insight to be able to quickly gain there. Now, this is another scenario you'll see is cost per conversion is good, but your return on ad spend is not good. And basically this tells us is we're getting leads and customers for the target we want to be at, but they're not spending enough. So really, it's not really worth running this channel because the amount we're getting is not big enough compared to the cost. So with these kind of channels, what I like to do is I don't like to just shut these off right away because you're getting a good lead cost. This would be one worth looking at and trying to come up with ways you can get this to work. So there's a variety of things you can do to try to increase conversions. But the key here is you're actually looking at it and seeing what can we do to improve this because it's not ultimately not driving the return we need. And if you can't get it to work after some effort and some trial and error, then it's a good time to take this budget and just reallocate it to something that's working better or just keep it entirely. So this is where this template can start to help you understand like how to reallocate your marketing budget. And then the final scenario is the most obvious one where we're not performing well on either metric. So the leads are expensive and they're not spending any money. So this is one where you really have to do something drastic because it's not working at all. So this is one where I would consider pausing it and reallocating the budget. Or if you really believe in the long term of that marketing channel, then you could really start to sit down and analyze with your team, what can we do to actually make this better and try to get it to work? But this is really a good candidate to potentially shift into something that's already working and kind of double down on the channels where the lead cost is low and they're spending enough to make it worth it. So this, the nice thing about this process is you only need to fill in a few data points. It'll run some of these formulas. You could tailor it based on what your own cost per lead targets are and your own return you want to see from your marketing. And then all the analysis will update automatically. And I like to update this on a monthly basis and start to fill in next month, because then what you'll start to see is some trends over time. Sometimes you might see a channel that was working well, like organic search, eventually stops working. And it's nice to be able to see that and not go too long without fixing it. So if you're filling this in every month, for some companies that have a lot of data, every week is even a good option, but for many, monthly will work. You'll start to see the trends, and really you'll be able to figure out exactly what's working and then what you potentially need to adjust.